when a wild bobcat scratched at the door of a remote mountain cabin in the middle of a blizzard. 70-year-old Ranger Garrett Holley knew the golden rule of survival. Never, under any circumstances, let a predator inside. But this cat wasn't alone. Behind her, in the white mist, burned the yellow eyes of a wolf pack that had already surrounded the house. Garrett faced a choice. Let nature carry out its brutal right on his porch, or break the law, risk his safety, and open the door. He thought he was saving her. But he had no idea that this act of kindness would save his own life when a silent killer came for him not from the woods, but from inside his own home. Before we dive into this incredible drama of survival, subscribe and write and comment where you are watching from, and what time is it now. The storm had been gathering strength all day. It wasn't just a snowfall. It was a white wall cutting off Garrett Hale's ranger cabin from the rest of the world. The Colorado high country doesn't forgive mistakes, and after 40 years of service, Garrett knew this better than anyone. At 70, Garrett moved a bit slower than he used to. His joints ached when the pressure dropped, and the cold seemed to bite deeper into his bones. Since his wife Erin passed away 2 years ago, he had retreated here to an altitude of 10,000 feet. He was looking for a silence loud enough to drown out the grief of losing his partner of 40 years. That evening, the temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. The wind hammered the log walls like a giant mallet. Garrett checked the radio, just static. He was alone, cut off. He threw a thick log into the cast iron stove, poured himself some black coffee, and sat down to review his logs. The cabin smelled of dry wood and old paper. It was the scent of safety. But suddenly, that comfort was shattered by a sound that didn't belong. Thump, thump. A heavy, dull sound on the wooden decking of the porch. It wasn't a branch scraping. Footsteps. Someone was standing right outside the thin door. A bear? A lost hiker? Garrett slowly set down his cup, his hand trembling slightly with age. He took a heavy flashlight from the wall and walked to the window, wiping the fogged glass with his flannel sleeve. The beam of light cut through the darkness and caught a silhouette in the blizzard. Garrett froze. It was a bobcat, but not the phantom he was used to seeing fleetingly through binoculars. This animal stood motionless right under the window. Her luxurious spotted fur was matted into icicles. Her tufted ears were pinned back, and her body was racked with violent shivering. She looked pitiful, but when she turned sideways, Garrett realized the true reason for her desperation. Her belly was low and distended. She was heavily pregnant. She was barely standing on her feet from exhaustion. Garrett looked at her, and his professional mind screamed, "Don't interfere. This is nature." But his old heart clenched. She had come to the light because she had nowhere else to go. And then he saw the reason why she wasn't running. Behind her, at the edge of the illuminated zone, the snow moved. At first, it looked like shadows from the wind, but then the shadows took shape. One pair of yellow eyes. A second. A third. Wolves. It was an organized hunting pack. They weren't rushing. They knew the bobcat was cornered, ahead a locked door. Behind death. The wolves were waiting for the cold to do its work, so she would fall her own. One of the wolves, a large gray male, took a step onto the porch stairs. He bared his teeth, steam from his mouth mixing with the snow. The bobcat pressed her back against the cabin door. She hissed, but it was a sound of despair, not strength. Garrett gasped. He remembered Erin. He remembered how they had always wanted children, and how she always said, "Every life is sacred, Garrett." He couldn't let a mother be torn apart on his doorstep. Garrett moved as fast as his 70-year-old legs would allow. He grabbed the flare gun he kept by the entrance. He threw the latch and flung the door open. The cold hit his face like a physical blow. "Get out! Get away!" He shouted, his voice raspy but commanding. He raised his arm and fired into the black sky. A red signal flare screamed upward, illuminating the forest with a bloody light. The wolves flinched. The bright flash and chemical smells spooked them. The alpha barked, turned, and the pack dissolved into the darkness as silently as they had appeared. Garrett looked down. The bobcat hadn't run. She was too weak. She lay at his feet, looking up at him. There was no fear of the human in her gaze, only deadly fatigue. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Garrett stepped back into the warmth of the cabin. He made no sudden movements. He simply left the door open and sat on the floor by the opposite wall. "Come in," he whispered. "I won't hurt you." The minutes stretched like an eternity. The bobcat lifted her head, sniffed the warm air escaping the house, and made one last effort. She dragged her heavy body over the threshold. Garrett gently, soundlessly, closed the door. The roar of the storm vanished instantly, replaced by the crackling of wood in the stove. Now, in his living room, just 10 feet away, lay one of North America's most elusive predators. The bobcat tried to stand, but her paws slid on the smooth floor. She snorted in fear. Garrett slowly stood up, his knees popping. "You need to eat," he said calmly, avoiding eye contact. A direct stare is aggression to cats. He went to the fridge and took out a piece of raw venison he kept for himself. He placed the meat in a bowl and slid it across the floor toward her. The reaction was instant. She hissed, showing sharp fangs, but the smell of blood overcame the fear. She pounced on the food, swallowing chunks almost without chewing. The next 2 days turned into a strange game of statues. The bobcat took up a position under the massive oak table. That was her fortress. Garrett lived his life, trying not to make loud noises. He read books, drank tea, and tended the fire. Outside, the storm raged on. The wolves returned twice. Garrett heard their howling and saw the bobcat tense up, flattening her ears. In those moments, the old man would walk to the window with his lantern, showing that he was guarding the perimeter. She saw this, and over time, her gaze changed. She stopped watching his every step. She began to sleep. On the 3rd night, the temperature dropped even lower. The wood burned faster than usual. Garrett, exhausted from the tension and constant watch, loaded the stove to the brim and went to sleep, wrapped in his sleeping bag. He didn't know that the high wind and wet snow had formed an ice plug at the top of the chimney. The draft was gone. Smoke, and most terrifyingly, invisible carbon monoxide, began to fill the room. Garrett dreamed he was drowning in a black lake. The water was heavy and viscous, filling his lungs. He wanted to wake up, but his body wouldn't obey. His limbs felt like lead. His head was splitting with pain, as if squeezed in a vice. Consciousness was fading. It was a sweet, quiet death. Suddenly, a sharp pain pierced through the darkness. Something sharp dug into his shoulder. Garrett groaned, trying to brush it away, but the pain repeated, this time across his cheek. A strong strike, claws out. He forced his eyes open with immense effort. The world was swimming. Right in front of his face, inches away, were the eyes of the bobcat. Dilated pupils, bared mouth. She was standing on his chest and screaming loudly, hoarsely, right into his face. It wasn't an attack. Animals sense a lack of oxygen before humans do. She was panicking. She understood they were both dying, and the only creature who could open the door was this immobile giant. She struck him again with her paw, scratching his nose. The blood and pain gave Garrett the necessary adrenaline spike. He inhaled and coughed. The air was thick and bitter. Smoke. He wheezed. He tried to stand, but fell from the bed to the floor. The bobcat jumped back, continuing to meow frantically. Garrett crawled. Every meter was a battle for the old man. He was nauseous, his vision darkening. He dragged himself to the door, grabbed the handle, and leaning his whole body weight against it, pushed it open. Hurricane force, freezing, pure air rushed into the cabin, sweeping away the poisonous gas. Garrett collapsed face down in the snow on the threshold, greedily gulping oxygen. The bobcat didn't run away. She sat next to him in the wind, inhaling life. They sat like that for 10 minutes, man and beast, side by side, shivering from cold, but alive. If she hadn't woken him, he would never have woken up. The debt was paid. When Garrett aired out the cabin and cleared the chimney, returning to the warmth, he noticed a change. The bobcat didn't go back under the table. She lay down on his sheepskin rug right by the fireplace. Her breathing became heavy and ragged. It was starting. Garrett realized the stress from the carbon monoxide had accelerated labor. He turned off the bright lights, leaving only the flicker of the fire, and retreated to the far corner. "It's okay, girl. You're safe," he whispered. For the next hour, while the blizzard howled outside, the greatest magic of nature took place in the cramped cabin. Garrett heard a quiet squeak, then another. The mother worked tirelessly, cleaning the wet fur of the newborns, stimulating their breathing. By morning, when the sun finally broke through the clouds, 3 tiny kittens lay on the rug. They were the size of a hand, blind, spotted, looking like little fuzzy jelly beans. They instinctively sought milk, pushing at their mom with tiny paws. Garrett approached carefully, holding a bowl of water. The lynx lifted her head. She was exhausted, but there was no fear or wariness in her eyes anymore. She allowed him to place the bowl right next to her nose. She looked at him, then at her children, and slowly blinked. It was a sign of absolute trust. Garrett felt a tear roll down his wrinkled cheek. After 2 years of loneliness and grief, his home was suddenly filled with life. The next month became a true test of love and will for Garrett. The kittens grew fast. The cabin turned into a playground. They chewed his boots, climbed the curtains, and staged ambushes on Garrett from under the bed. He named them Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, using the military alphabet from his youth. But Garrett was a professional. He knew he couldn't keep them. If they got used to humans, they would die in the wild. He contacted Dr. Lauren McKay, the park biologist. When she arrived and saw the scene, a rugged 70-year-old ranger being climbed on by 3 lynx cubs, while the mother watched calmly from an armchair, she couldn't believe her eyes. "You've done the impossible, Garrett," she said. "But you know what has to be done." They developed a soft release plan. Garrett built an insulated den box 50 yards from the cabin. They began feeding the family there, gradually reducing contact. It broke Garrett's heart. Every time he closed a door in the face of a kitten that wanted to play, he felt like a traitor. But he knew this was the only way. The day of farewell came in mid-April. The snow had melted. The forest had come alive. Garrett filled the bowls by the forest den for the last time. The mother bobcat emerged from the shelter. She looked magnificent, strong, healthy, with a shiny coat. Behind her tumbled 3 fluffy rascals. She ate, then stopped and looked toward the cabin where Garrett stood in the window. She stood there for a long time, as if etching his image into her memory. Then she made a short, sharp sound of command to the children. She turned and ran into the forest. The kittens, hopping clumsily, hurried after her. None of them looked back. They were home. 6 months passed. Garrett got used to the silence again, though now it felt empty rather than peaceful. One autumn morning, he was checking memory cards from trail cameras set 3 miles from his home. He scrolled through hundreds of photos of deer and foxes until he stopped. In a night shot, under the infrared flash, she stood, the same bobcat. And next to her 2 strong, almost adult young bobcats. Sadly, not all survive in the wild, and one was missing. But that is the law of the forest. But the most amazing thing was what she did. Most animals ignore the camera or get scared of it. But in the next frame, the bobcat walked right up to the lens and rubbed her cheek against it, leaving a smudge on the glass. Garrett smiled, tracing his finger over the screen. It was her hello, she remembered. He turned off the computer and looked out the window at the snow-capped peaks. He didn't feel like a lonely old man anymore. Somewhere out there, in the wild silence, beat hearts that he had saved and that had saved him. This story proves that kindness is a universal language understood even by the most dangerous predators. What would you have done? Would you have risked letting a wild animal into your bedroom? Let us know in the comments. And make sure to share this video with friends. Let's make the world a little kinder.